Imagine being a young princess in ancient Egypt. One day you're playing in the palace gardens with your sisters. The next you're told you must marry your own father, the most powerful man on earth. This wasn't a twisted myth. It was real. The Pharaoh Akhenaten forced his own daughters into marriage, and he claimed it was the will of the gods. But this wasn't just about power or politics. The genetic nightmare that followed would produce sickly heirs, a collapsing empire, and ultimately lead to one of history's most systematic attempts to erase a pharaoh from existence. What drove the most powerful ruler on earth to destroy his own family and his kingdom in service to his revolutionary god? In 1353 BC, Prince Amenhotep IV inherited the throne of Egypt from his father, Amenhotep III, who had ruled over 38 years of unprecedented prosperity. Egypt was the superpower of the ancient world. Its treasury overflowed with gold from Nubia. Tribute flowed in from conquered territories stretching from Sudan to Syria, and its monuments were the envy of every civilization on earth. The young pharaoh should have been content maintaining the cosmic order that blessed Egypt for millennia, honouring Amun-Ra and the traditional gods whose priests controlled nearly a third of Egypt's wealth. But something burned within this king. Perhaps it was his intense fascination with the sun disk, the Aten, a minor solar deity that spoke to him of universal truth. Or perhaps it was the whispers of priests who told him that all the elaborate mythology, all the complex rituals, all the hidden mysteries of the traditional temples were just elaborate lies designed to keep power in the hands of a corrupt priesthood. Contemporary records describe Amenhotep IV as physically distinctive, tall, lanky, with an elongated skull, narrow shoulders, and wide hips that gave him an androgynous appearance that set him apart from traditional ideals of Egyptian kingship. Later, artistic depictions would exaggerate these features to almost grotesque proportions. Whether these were actual physical traits, artistic symbolism, or signs of a genetic disorder that would plague his entire bloodline remains hotly debated. By his 4th year as pharaoh, he had begun building temples to the Aten at Karnak itself, in the shadow of Amun's greatest sanctuary. The priests watched with growing alarm as their young king elevated this solar deity above their ancient god. The first signs of revolution appeared in art. For 3,000 years, Egyptian art followed rigid conventions showing idealized eternal forms. Suddenly, reliefs appeared showing genuine human emotion. The royal family beneath the Aten's rays, each ray ending in a tiny hand offering life. His queen, Nefertiti, stood beside him, not as a distant figure of majesty, but as a living woman. Their daughters, Meritaten, Meketaten, and Kesenamun, were depicted as real children playing beneath their god's benevolent gaze. In his 5th year, Amenhotep IV made his most dramatic declaration. He would no longer honour Amun in his name. From now on, he was Akhenaten, devoted to the Aten. Nefertiti became Neferneferuaten. Beautiful is the beauty of the Aten. But transformation wasn't enough. In his 6th year, Akhenaten made a decision that shocked his court. He would abandon Thebes entirely and build a completely new city dedicated solely to the Aten. He chose a virgin site 200 miles north of Thebes, backed by limestone cliffs where the sun seemed to emerge each morning, creating a daily miracle that reinforced his theology. He called this place Akhetaten, Horizon of the Aten. Construction employed tens of thousands of workers using revolutionary techniques. Standardized stone blocks called talatat could be carried by a single man, allowing rapid construction while maintaining monumental scale. Within 2 years, the basic infrastructure was complete. The great temple of the Aten dominated the city's heart. But unlike traditional Egyptian temples with their dark, mysterious chambers, this temple was entirely open to the sky. Hundreds of offering tables arranged in courtyards, no walls blocking the sun's rays. There were no hidden chambers, no secret rituals, no complex mythology. The god was the sun itself, visible to all, requiring no intermediaries. The theology of Atenism was remarkably sophisticated. Unlike Egypt's traditional hundreds of deities, Atenism posited a single universal creator whose power manifested through the visible sun disk. The great hymn to the Aten, possibly composed by Akhenaten himself, demonstrates striking parallels to Psalm 104, leading scholars to speculate about connections to early monotheistic traditions. In his 9th year, Akhenaten moved his entire court to this desert paradise. life revolved around worshipping the Aten through elaborate daily ceremonies timed to the sun's movement. Morning worship began before dawn, afternoon ceremonies at the sun's zenith, evening worship as the sun set behind the cliffs. But even in paradise, royal succession demanded attention. Nefertiti had given Akhenaten 6 daughters, but no son to inherit the throne. In ancient Egypt, this presented a crisis requiring unprecedented solutions. Around Akhenaten's 12th year, Nefertiti mysteriously disappeared from historical records. Whether through death, disgrace, or transformation into a co-ruler remains one of Egyptology's great mysteries. Akhenaten's response was shocking even by ancient Egyptian standards. To secure his dynasty and theological revolution, he turned to his own daughters. Royal incest wasn't unknown in Egypt. Sibling marriages occurred regularly among pharaohs, but the systematic nature of Akhenaten's arrangements went beyond anything previously documented in human history. Picture the psychological complexity of this decision. These weren't just political arrangements. They were a desperate attempt to preserve a dying revolution through the most intimate family bonds imaginable. His eldest daughter, Meritaten, probably about 16, officially became his chief queen. Contemporary reliefs show her in positions traditionally reserved for queens, wearing royal regalia, participating in religious ceremonies as Akhenaten's wife. But she had grown up surrounded by art and literature celebrating the intimate bonds of family life. Palace walls showed tender domestic scenes of her as a beloved daughter, playing with her sisters beneath the benevolent rays of the Aten. Now she was expected to transform her filial love into conjugal devotion, to become both daughter and wife to the same man. The theological justification was complex but internally consistent within Akhenaten's religious system. The Aten was described as containing both male and female principles, both father and mother of creation. The royal family, as earthly representatives of divine power, were expected to mirror this cosmic unity. By marrying his daughter, Akhenaten was creating an earthly reflection of divine self-generation, demonstrating that the royal house contained within itself all the creative forces necessary for continued rule. Each daughter who became queen could potentially produce the male heir Akhenaten desperately needed. By keeping succession within his immediate family, he prevented rival branches from challenging his innovations. When Meritaten married Smenkhare, a co-regent who may have been Akhenaten's brother or adopted heir, around the 15th year this created an unprecedented situation where she was simultaneously wife to 2 pharaohs, her father Akhenaten and his co-regent. Akhenaten then elevated his next daughter Ankhesenamun to chief queen. This young woman, no more than 13 or 14, found herself at the centre of a desperate attempt to preserve her father's revolution through bloodline concentration. The human cost was tragic and deeply disturbing. In the tomb of Mayatumdun, reliefs show what appears to be the death of Princess Meketaten on a birthing bed, with midwives and attendants surrounding the deathbed scene. A wet nurse holds a newborn infant, suggesting she died in childbirth, possibly after bearing her father's child. She was likely no older than 15. This wasn't an isolated incident. The extreme youth of these daughter queens, the concentrated inbreeding, and the high-pressure environment of Akhenaten created a perfect storm of medical and psychological trauma. Archaeological evidence from the royal cemetery reveals multiple infant burials and young women who died in their teens, silent testimony to the human cost of theological ambition. Yet Akhenaten seemed oblivious to the suffering his revolution was causing within his own family. Palace reliefs from this period show him in what appear to be genuinely intimate family scenes with his daughter wives, embracing them, sharing meals, participating in private rituals of family life. The iconography suggests these weren't purely ceremonial relationships, but actual marriages in every sense of the word. Meanwhile, the world beyond Akhenaten grew increasingly unstable. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence found in the city's ruins, reveal a pattern of neglect in Egypt's international relations. Vassal kings in Syria and Palestine wrote desperate pleas for military support against invading forces, only to receive no response from a pharaoh consumed with religious experiments and family arrangements. "To the king, my lord, my god, my son," wrote the ruler of Byblos, "7 times and 7 times I fall at the feet of the king. May the king give thought to his city and send archers. If there are no archers this year, all the lands of the king will perish." Similar desperate messages came from rulers throughout the Levant. But Akhenaten's responses were vague promises that never materialized. Egypt's great military machine began to rust from disuse, and enemies noted this weakness. Internally, displaced priests of Amun may have gone underground but hadn't disappeared. Archaeological evidence suggests Atenism never penetrated deeply into Egyptian society outside the royal court. Common people, denied access to familiar deities, likely maintained traditional practices in private. The economic disruption was severe. Temple estates transferred from Amun to the Aten required new administrative structures. Traditional trade relationships were disrupted. The concentration of resources on Akhenaten came at the expense of infrastructure throughout the kingdom. In his 17th year, around 1336 BC, Akhenaten died under mysterious circumstances. There's no evidence of violence or obvious illness. He may have simply worn out from the psychological strain of his complex arrangements and growing pressures of rulership. His immediate successor was probably Neferueten, possibly Nefertiti ruling under a new name, or one of his daughter queens. This shadowy figure ruled briefly, attempting to maintain the Atenist revolution, while dealing with practical problems Akhenaten had left unresolved. But the forces of restoration were already in motion. The traditional priesthood, military and bureaucracy had been marginalized but not destroyed. They saw opportunity in Akhenaten's death to reverse the revolution. The child who emerged from this complex web became history's most famous pharaoh. Tutankhamun was probably 8 or 9 when he became pharaoh. Modern DNA analysis confirms his parents were full siblings, most likely Akhenaten and one of his sister wives. His wife was Ankhesenamun, the same daughter who had been Akhenaten's queen. This remarkable woman had served as daughter, wife and stepmother to various royal family members before finally becoming queen to a boy who may have been her half-brother, son, or nephew. The restoration began immediately. Within 3 years, Tutankhamun changed his name from Tutankhaten to honor Amun. The court abandoned Akhenaten and returned to Memphis. The great temples of the Aten were closed, their treasuries transferred to restored traditional temples. After Tutankhamun's death at 19 and the brief reign of Ai, General Horemheb seized the throne and launched systematic historical erasure that was unprecedented in its thoroughness and brutality. This wasn't just political revenge, it was an attempt to undo reality itself. Every mention of Akhenaten's name was chiseled from walls with desperate fury, as if the chisel strikes could somehow undo the trauma he had inflicted on the kingdom. Every statue bearing his likeness was smashed into fragments so small they could never be reassembled. The revolutionary capital of Akhenaten was systematically dismantled, its stones carted away like evidence from a crime scene. But the most chilling aspect of this erasure was its psychological precision. The priests and officials who had survived the Amarna period understood exactly what they were doing. In ancient Egyptian belief, to be forgotten was to die a second death, to be erased not just from earth, but from the afterlife itself. They were condemning Akhenaten to eternal non-existence. The workers who carried out this destruction may have included some who had actually lived in Akhenaten, who had participated in the daily rituals, who had watched the royal family's tragic downward spiral firsthand. As they struck their hammers against the stone faces of the daughters who had become queens, they were erasing not just names, but memories of real people they had known, young women who had laughed and played and died too young in service to their father's impossible dream. Official king lists compiled in later dynasties simply skipped from Amenhotep III to Horemheb, as if Akhenaten's 18-year reign never existed. For scribes copying these lists centuries later, there was no indication that anything had ever been missing. The gap was seamless, perfect, a surgical removal of nearly 2 decades of history. For over 3,000 years, this erasure was largely successful. Only when archaeologists began excavating Amarna's ruins in the late 19th century did the full scope of his revolution emerge. Modern DNA analysis confirmed the incestuous relationships within his family, revealing genetic defects in Tutankhamun that speak to the human cost of divine ambition. Today, standing among Akhenaten's ruins, we can still hear the echo of hammers striking stone, erasing names and dreams from the walls of eternity. The pharaoh who married his daughters in service to his god, who proclaimed everything his people believed was false, remains frozen in that moment when one man's vision of truth collided with 3,000 years of tradition. His revolution failed, but it leaves us questioning. Was he a visionary ahead of his time, or a dangerous fanatic whose obsessions nearly destroyed one of history's greatest civilizations? Perhaps he was both, a reminder that even the most powerful rulers remain tragically, devastatingly human.